In my family, success wasn't just encouraged, it was a blood sport, and my sister was the reigning champion. I'm Emmy Fisher, and in the polished, judgmental air of our annual family reunion, I was the resident failure. Every clinking glass and backhanded compliment was a reminder that my sabbatical, what they called my life's work, was a deep disappointment. They saw my quiet life as a white flag of surrender, a hobby I'd eventually outgrow. They had no idea that my silence wasn't weakness, it was a strategy. This year, the truth had a way of inviting itself to the party, and their world was about to break. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The smell of lemon polish and simmering roast beef always meant the annual Fisher family reunion was imminent. It was the scent of performance. I ran a hand over the dining room table, its surface gleaming under the chandelier, and felt the familiar quiet tension settle in my stomach. I was Emmy Fisher, the prodigal daughter who hadn't quite strayed far enough now back in my suburban American childhood home, preparing the stage for my family's judgment. At 30, I was the resident creative, the humanitarian, which in the conservative lexicon of my parents, Margaret and Paul Fisher, translated directly to aimless. My mother walked in fluffing a throw pillow that was already perfectly fluffed. "Emmy, honey, that dip looks interesting. Did you get a chance to look at those corporate postings I sent you just to tide you over, you know?" I smiled a tight, practiced motion. "I'm good, Mom. My project work is keeping me busy." Her sigh was barely audible, but I heard it. It was the sigh of loving disappointment, the sound she made when she contrasted my life with my sister's. My father, Paul, was simpler. His approval was measured in promotions and stable stock options, two things I had purposefully left behind. He believed in tangible success, the kind you could print on a business card, not the kind I was quietly building in communities he'd never heard of. The sound of a luxury sedan crunching gravel in the driveway announced her. Clara. My older sister didn't just arrive, she made an entrance. The front door opened, and she swept in on a cloud of expensive perfume and social savvy. "Emmy, you're here. Mom, Dad, the house looks perfect." She kissed the air near our cheeks, her diamond earrings catching the light. Clara thrived on the recognition. She was the conventional standard-bearer, the one who had checked every box: prestigious law firm, high-earning husband, a meticulously curated life that looked flawless on social media. "We just closed the biggest merger of the quarter," she announced, shrugging off her coat to reveal a tailored dress that probably cost more than my last 3 months of rent. "Paul's taking me to Aspen to celebrate. Oh, and they finalized my promotion. Senior partner before 35. Can you believe it?" My parents beamed, their pride palpable. "That's our girl," Dad said, clapping her on the shoulder. I finished setting out the napkins, each one a small white flag of surrender. The comparisons didn't even need to be spoken anymore. They hung in the air, thick as the scent of the roast. Clara was success. I was between jobs. I felt the weight of their collective assumptions settle over me like a shroud. To them, I was the one who had potential, but squandered it, the one taking a permanent sabbatical from reality. They saw my humanitarian work as a quaint hobby, my creative projects as distractions. They couldn't understand why I'd walk away from a 6-figure corporate track, why I'd choose grant proposals and field reports in muddy boots over boardrooms and bonuses. My choices were an indictment of their values, so they processed them as failure. My quiet ambition, the relentless drive that had me working 18-hour days to establish my nonprofit, was invisible to them. They only saw the lack of a designer handbag, the absence of a flashy title. I felt the familiar simmering resentment prickle under my skin. I wasn't aimless. I was focused on a different horizon, one they refused to see. My self-awareness was a shield, but it felt heavy. The doorbell rang again, signaling the arrival of the extended family, the chorus for Clara's performance. I braced myself. The evening was just beginning, and the small, subtle humiliations were already starting to pile up. My Aunt Sarah was the first through the door, hugging Clara tightly. Clara, you look like a CEO. Stunning. She turned to me, her eyes doing a rapid dismissive scan. And Emmy, it's so good to see you. Home. The unspoken words lingered. Still here, still figuring things out. The compliments and comparisons began to fly, a flurry of backhanded remarks and polite inquiries about my plans, each one a tiny paper cut, reminding me of my place in the family hierarchy, the failure. I tried to make myself small, circulating with a fixed smile as I navigated the minefield of familial small talk. Emmy, honey, my Uncle David said, cornering me by the fireplace. Good to see you taking a break. This sabbatical of yours doing you good. I gripped my glass of water. It's not really a sabbatical, Uncle David. My nonprofit work is pretty demanding. He waved a dismissive hand. Right. Your projects. Well, you let me know when you're ready to get back into the real world. I know a guy in marketing. The euphemisms were a constant barrage, sabbatical time off between opportunities. They were all polite, coded ways of calling me a drifter, of framing my life's work as a childish phase I would eventually outgrow. The room felt suffocating, a pressurized chamber of social claustrophobia. The air was thick with the scent of Clara's sharp, expensive perfume and the cloying sweetness of my mother's potpourri. From the dining room, I could hear the high-pitched clinking of my mother's best china, a sound I associated with performance and judgment. Every surface gleamed, from the polished silver to the patterned tablecloth that felt as rigid and suffocating as the family's expectations. Clara was the center of it all, a vibrant splash of color in her tailored crimson dress, her designer shoes clicking with an assertive rhythm on the hardwood floors. She was a living, breathing advertisement for the only kind of success my family valued. I, in my simple linen dress and flats, was a pale watercolor next to her glossy oil painting. She found me replenishing the appetizer tray. "Oh, Emmy's still helping out," she said, her voice loud enough for our cousins to hear. "It's wonderful you have so much free time. I was just telling Jenna how I barely have time to breathe, what with the partnership track and closing the new merger." She turned to our cousin. "You have to be ruthless with your time, Jenna. You can't just float. Look at my life and then, well, just look." The juxtaposition was as subtle as a sledgehammer. My work, which involved complex grant writing, international logistics, and managing a team of volunteers, was reduced to free time. Her success, measured in billable hours and bonuses, was real. I saw my parents watching my mother with a look of pained worry, my father with a "that's my girl" pride aimed squarely at Clara. They were her willing audience, reinforcing her narrative with every proud nod. Their silence on my behalf was a deafening endorsement of her words. Emmy must fit their understanding of success, or she doesn't exist. The betrayal was a slow, creeping cold. It wasn't a single stab, but the dull, repeated pressure of 1,000 small cuts. This was the family I had tried so hard to stay connected to, the people I had hoped would one day see me for who I was. But I was internalizing the truth: they couldn't see me. They could only see Clara's reflection. I felt my composure starting to fray, the practiced smile feeling heavy on my face. I needed air. I murmured an excuse about checking on the dessert and slipped out of the crowded living room, the sound of their laughter following me. I headed for the quiet of the back hallway, just needing a single moment to breathe. As I passed the study, the door was cracked open. I heard Clara's voice, no longer performing for the crowd, but low and laced with genuine disdain. "I'm just being honest, Mom. It's humiliating. She's 30 years old, and what has she done? She's a failure. What do you even tell your friends when they ask about her?" My mother's reply was a quiet, weary sigh. I just say she's still finding herself." Failure. The word landed with the force of a physical blow, sucking the air from my lungs. It wasn't just a backhanded compliment or a subtle dig, it was a verdict. I stood frozen in the hallway, the shadows hiding me. The hurt was sharp, but something else rose beneath it, a cold, clarifying anger. All these years I had stayed quiet, hoping my work would speak for itself. But they weren't listening. I retreated, stepping back from the door, but it wasn't a surrender. It was a strategic withdrawal. I would not cry. I would not confront them. Not yet. I would let them have their evening. But the script had just changed. My silence was no longer passive. It was a loaded weapon. I didn't rejoin the party. Instead, I slipped upstairs to my old bedroom, the walls still painted a hopeful, naive yellow from my high school years. The muffled sounds of the reunion, the clinking glasses, the forced laughter. Clara's sharp, confident voice dominating the conversation drifted up the stairs, sounding hollow and distant. Failure. The word echoed in the quiet room. I sat on the edge of the bed, the failure they all pitied, and the chasm between their perception and my reality felt impossibly wide. My mind flashed back 5 years to a glass-walled conference room overlooking a sterile corporate park. I was wearing a suit just as sharp as Clara's, my nameplate gleaming on the desk. I had the promotion, the bonus, the 401k matching, and I was suffocating. I remembered the exact moment I quit, the look of profound confusion on my parents' faces. "But why, Emmy?" my mother had asked, her voice trembling. "You had everything." Clara had been smug, convinced this was some quarter-life crisis I'd regret. They saw it as giving up. I saw it as the first time I'd ever truly chosen. I remembered investing my savings not in the portfolio my father recommended, but in a fledgling humanitarian project to bring clean water filters to rural villages in Peru. I'd lived out of a backpack for 6 months, learning logistics, supply chain management, and community organizing on the fly. It was the hardest work I'd ever done, and the most alive I'd ever felt. That project became the cornerstone of my nonprofit. While Clara was climbing the corporate ladder, I was in muddy trenches negotiating with local governments, securing international grants, and building sustainable solutions for communities that had been overlooked. While they gossiped about my sabbatical, I was solving real-world problems. I pulled out my phone, the screen a bright rectangle in the dim room. I opened my work email, a world they knew nothing about. There was a report from my field director in Kenya, complete with photos of the new schoolhouse we'd just finished funding. There was a message from an advocacy group in D.C., confirming that our foundation's research on food deserts was being cited in an upcoming policy brief. A news alert popped up. An independent watchdog group had listed my small hobby nonprofit as one of the most effective humanitarian startups of the last 3 years. I scrolled through images of families, of running water, of children reading books in a library I had designed the blueprint for. This was my nothing. This was my failure. A wave of cold, hard clarity washed over me. I wasn't hurt anymore. I was empowered. I looked at the wall, at the framed debate trophies my parents had polished for the reunion. They were celebrating a version of me that hadn't existed for a decade. The emotional tension in my chest wasn't just resentment, it was the pressure of a life lived in dual realities. Downstairs, Clara was performing her success, a loud, shallow monologue that required constant applause. My accomplishments were silent. They existed in spreadsheets and field reports, in the quiet tectonic shifts of policy, and in the lives of thousands of people who would never know my name. My silence tonight, my refusal to correct their taunts and defend my choices, hadn't been weakness. It had been restraint. It was strategic. Why would I beg for validation from people who didn't even speak my language? I was contrasting my silent, tangible impact with Clara's noisy, performative status. The gap was laughable. The gossip and judgment from downstairs suddenly felt incredibly small, like the buzzing of a distant fly. I realized then that their ignorance wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was a universal, willful blindness. They were so entrenched in their narrow definition of success, the suburban house, the luxury car, the partner title, that they were fundamentally incapable of seeing mine. It wasn't that they wouldn't see my real life. It was that they couldn't. Not without dramatic, irrefutable proof. Not without their entire world being shaken. And as I sat there, the quiet hum of my phone connecting me to a life larger than their entire reunion, I realized I wouldn't have to provide that proof myself. It was already on its way. I took a deep breath, the cold, clarifying anger settling into a quiet resolve. I would go back down. I would endure the rest of the night not as their victim, but as an observer. My work, my life didn't need their validation. I walked down the stairs, the sound of Clara's sharp, confident laughter echoing up from the living room. She was in the middle of a story, gesticulating wildly, her audience, our family, hanging on her every word. So I told the board, you can have results, or you can have excuses, but you can't have both. And that, she said, raising her glass, is how we close the merger. Applause and murmurs of brilliant Clara filled the room. I slipped in, taking a position near the back wall, but the atmosphere had changed for me. It was no longer a tribunal, it was a comedy. In the corner, the large television was on, tuned to the national evening news, the volume muted, as it had been all night, serving as a silent backdrop. My Uncle David was standing near it, and as Clara's story wound down, he glanced at the screen. "Huh," he said, frowning. "Paul, turn that up a moment, will you? That looks like—" My father, beaming from Clara's performance, picked up the remote and clicked the volume. The anchor's serious, professional voice suddenly filled the room, cutting through the self-congratulatory chatter. But the big story tonight is one of profound, unexpected impact. The Committee for the Global Impact Vanguard Award has, in a surprise announcement, named its youngest-ever recipient. The screen cut from the anchor to a graphic, with the award's official seal. The $20 million grant is awarded this year to Emmy Fisher. My name. My name echoed in the suddenly completely silent room. A photo of me, not a family snapshot, but a professional shot taken in a Kenyan village. Me smiling with a group of local engineers filled the screen. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, a choked, strangled gasp. Uncle David's wine glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor. Founder of the Clearwater Initiative, a nonprofit that has fundamentally changed the landscape of water purification in developing nations. The anchor began to list the specifics, the proprietary filter I had helped design, the supply chain logistics I had built from scratch, the policy papers that had influenced 3 governments. What started as a small project 5 years ago has now provided sustainable clean water access to over 200,000 people across 3 continents. 200,000. My father stared at the screen, his face ashen, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. He looked from the TV to me and back again, as if he couldn't connect the two. Phones, which had been silent, began to buzz in unison across the room as the news alert hit the wire. My Aunt Sarah, her face pale, was the first to Google it. "Oh my God," she whispered, scrolling frantically. "Paul, Margaret, it's real. Forbes wrote about her. The Guardian. She's Emmy." The room erupted in a cacophony of whispers. "Is that our Emmy?" I had no idea. She never said a word. I watched Clara. Her smile was frozen, a brittle, terrifying mask. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her phone, her own screen glowing with the same articles. Her face, which had been so flush with victory, was rapidly draining of color, replaced by a sick gray pallor of disbelief and raw, unadulterated shame. The failure, the humiliation of the family, had just been awarded one of the largest and most prestigious humanitarian grants on the planet. In front of her entire audience. All eyes turned to me. I hadn't moved. I was perfectly calm, my hands loosely clasped in front of me. The chaos washed over me, but it couldn't touch me. My mother finally found her voice, a trembling whisper. "Emmy, honey, why didn't you say anything?" I looked at her, my gaze sweeping across my father, my aunt, my uncle, and finally landing on Clara. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the panicked whispers like a knife. "I did, Mom," I said, my tone even almost gentle. "I've been telling you for 5 years. When I said I was writing grants, this is what I was writing. When I said I was in Kenya, this is what I was doing. When you called it my sabbatical, this was the work you were dismissing." I took a step forward. "The little project you told me to quit, It just secured the funding to build 3 new schools and a permanent medical clinic in the Rift Valley. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of my parents' entire worldview shattering. The metrics they used to measure success, promotions, salaries, mergers were suddenly laughably small. The guilt in the room was a palpable, suffocating force. My mother looked like she was going to be sick. My father couldn't meet my eyes. Clara just stared at me, her mask of superiority completely gone, revealing the raw, confused envy beneath. I had them. They were all looking at me, waiting for me to rage, to cry, to demand the apology I so richly deserved. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted so violently it left a vacuum. And in that ringing silence, I knew I had a choice. I could use this moment for revenge, crucify them with their own petty judgments. I could unleash the years of hurt for my own catharsis. Or I could do something else. The moment was mine. I didn't choose revenge. I chose the truth. I let the silence hang for another second, letting them all sit with the weight of the shattered illusion, the shards of my uncle's wine glass, still glittering on the floor, like a monument to their mistake. My gaze rested on my mother, her face a mask of confusion and dawning regret. "You asked why I didn't say anything," I said, my voice still quiet, but it carried across the room. "I've been talking about my work for years. The real question is, why didn't you listen?" My father found his voice first, a gruff, choked sound. "A Vanguard Award. Emmy, that's incredible. We just didn't understand." "No, Dad, you didn't want to understand," I said, not unkindly. "It didn't fit. It wasn't a law firm or a stock portfolio. It wasn't Clara." I turned my head, my eyes locking with my sister's. Her defensiveness was already rising, her shame curdling into anger. You deceived us, Emmy." Clara's voice was sharp, a little too high. "You let us. You walked around here looking like that." She gestured vaguely at my simple dress, letting Mom and Dad worry, letting me think you were drowning. "You let me believe you were a failure." Her hand was trembling, betraying the bravado of her words. "You called me a failure," I stated. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact. "Tonight, in the study, you told Mom I was humiliating." Clara flinched, her eyes darting to our mother, who was now openly crying, twisting a linen napkin in her hands until her knuckles were white. I only said that because I was worried," Clara shot back. "Because you're my sister, and you were throwing your life away on some fantasy." "Was it a fantasy, Clara?" I asked, my voice cutting. "Or was it just a metric you don't know how to measure? You live for validation. You need the title, the applause, the room full of people watching you win. You think success is a performance. I think it's impact." I took a step toward the center of the room. "You were right about one thing. I did let you misjudge me. I stopped fighting for your validation years ago. I stopped trying to make you see me. Because I realized something you haven't. Your validation is worthless. It's a distraction. While you were busy collecting accolades, I was busy working. While you were worried about what the neighbors thought, I was worried about a village's water supply. The time I would have spent trying to convince you I wasn't a failure, I used it to write the grant that just got funded on national television." My mother sobbed, a raw, painful sound. "Emmy, please. We're your family. We love you. We just wanted you to be secure. Like Clara. We wanted you to be happy. And you decided what my happiness should look like," I said, my voice softening for a second. "You decided my life was a cautionary tale while hers was the blueprint." The conflict peaked the air in the room, so thick with raw, unspoken truths it was hard to breathe. The household objects, the polished silver, the heavy curtains, the perfectly arranged flowers, all felt like silent witnesses to this emotional unraveling. My father looked at Clara, then at me. "She's your sister, Emmy. We're proud of you both, just differently." "That's the problem, Dad," I said. "You were proud of her, and you were worried about me. You saw her achievements, and you saw my sabbatical." You taught us that success was a competition, and you crowned her the winner before I even started the race. Clara finally broke. So what? She shouted, tears of rage and humiliation streaming down her face. You think you're better than me? You think you're some kind of saint now because you won an award? I worked for my life. I earned my partnership. I never said you didn't, I said, holding her gaze. My hands were perfectly steady. I'm just saying my work is not and has never been about you. It's not about this family. It's not about beating you. I let that sink in. The power shift was complete, a quiet tectonic realignment. I looked at my parents, their faces a mixture of pride, profound guilt, and a dawning, terrible understanding. I looked at Clara, who was seeing me, really seeing me for the first time, and I knew she was also seeing her own reflection in the wreckage. I love you all, I said, and I meant it. But I am done. I'm done being your disappointment. I'm done being your other daughter. My life is not a puzzle for you to solve, and my choices are not up for your approval. I didn't need to shout. The truth was loud enough. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the living room. I didn't storm off, I just left. I walked through the hallway past the dining table with its cooling roast and stepped out onto the quiet front porch, closing the door softly behind me. I left them in the silence to sit with the truth of what they had done. I finally just let them go. The crisp November air was a balm, sharp and clean against my face. I sat on the porch swing, its old chains groaning a familiar rhythmic complaint, a sound from my childhood. The streetlights cast long amber shadows on the lawn, and the muted sounds of the city, a distant siren. The hum of traffic felt more real than the suffocating performance I'd just left. The reunion I knew was effectively over. Cars were starting hushed goodbyes being exchanged at the door. I had retreated, but it wasn't a defeat. It was a claiming of space. I finally felt a sense of profound, unshakable independence. For years I had braced myself for these reunions, steeling myself against the barbs, the pity, the constant crushing weight of their misunderstanding. Now it was gone. The anger I had felt in the hallway, the triumph I'd felt during the reveal, both had receded, leaving behind a vast, quiet calm. I was free. I didn't need their applause, and I no longer feared their judgment. My growth hadn't happened in their living room. It had happened in mud-caked boots in Peru, in late-night grant-writing sessions, in the quiet, steady work of building something from nothing. The award was just a spotlight illuminating a structure I had already built in the dark. I heard the front door open and close softly. I didn't look up, but my father sat down on the other end of the swing, his weight making it dip. We sat in silence for a full minute, just the squeak of the chains and the distant hum of the world. I looked it up, he said finally, his voice thick. The Vanguard Award. The youngest ever, they said. $20 million. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his hands clasped tightly in his lap. You're a force, Emmy. We had no idea. I tried to tell you, Dad. No, he said, shaking his head. You tried to show us and we didn't know how to look. I only know how to measure things in quarterly reports. You're measuring in human lives. It's a different language. He finally turned to me, his eyes shining with a mixture of awe and a deep, profound shame. I am so, so sorry. I just nodded, absorbing the words. The apology mattered, but it wasn't the point. I know, I said. The front door opened again, and my mother's silhouette appeared. She just stood there watching us before going back inside. The party was gone. The house behind me was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, now not the tense performative silence, but a heavy processing one. I stayed on the porch, but after a while I went back inside needing a glass of water. The kitchen was where the last of the battle was being processed. My mother was mechanically loading the dishwasher, her movements jerky. Clara was at the table staring into a cold cup of coffee, her makeup smudged. She wasn't the sharp, polished executive anymore. She looked small like a teenager. All my life, Clara said, her voice low and rough, aimed at my mother. All my life it was, Clara's the smart one, Clara's the successful one. I had to be perfect. I had to get the grades, the law school acceptance, the partnership. Every single thing I did was for that look on your faces, the one you just gave her. My mother stopped a plate in her hand. That is not true, Clara. Isn't it? Clara laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. You put us in these boxes. I was the success, she was the creative one, the failure. I hated her for it. I was so envious that she got to just walk away, that she got to fail, and you'd still love her. You'd still coddle her and send her job postings. Me. If I missed a promotion, it was a family crisis. She finally looked up, her eyes landing on me as I stood in the doorway. The envy was gone, replaced by a raw, painful confusion. I spent so much energy being better than you, Emmy, and you weren't even in the race. I walked over and poured a glass of water. My internal reconciliation was settling, cementing itself. I saw them all not as villains, but as deeply flawed, limited people, all trapped by the same narrow definitions of success I had managed to escape. The pain they'd caused me was real, and I wouldn't forget it. But holding on to the anger felt redundant. It was like carrying a heavy coat in the sunshine. I was empowered. I didn't need to punish them. You weren't envious of me, Clara, I said, my voice gentle. You were envious of my freedom. The freedom you could have chosen too. She just stared at me, the fight gone out of her. The evening was winding down, the house settling around us. The family interactions were softening the sharp edges of their personalities, blunted by shock and regret. I felt a strange, tender ache for them. They were just beginning to process a reality I had been living for 5 years. The reconciliation wasn't complete, but a tentative understanding was dawning, and I realized I had the choice now, whether to let them in. The next morning, the house was submerged in a thick, awkward silence. The remnants of the reunion, a few stray glasses, the scent of stale wine were gone, but the emotional debris remained. My parents and Clara moved around the kitchen like ghosts, making coffee, avoiding eye contact, all of them orbiting the new, undeniable truth of my life. The shock had solidified into a heavy, hesitant curiosity. They were waiting, I realized, for me to lead, to tell them what to do with this new version of me. I had a local engagement that afternoon, a small presentation I'd agreed to give at a community center about sustainable development. It was the kind of thing I'd never have mentioned before, knowing they'd dismiss it as a hobby. Now it felt like a bridge. I have to give a talk in an hour, I announced into the silence. About the initiative. You can come if you want. My mother's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Yes, she said almost too quickly. We'd like that. Clara just nodded, her expression unreadable, and followed us to the car. The community center was a humble brick building, a far cry from the glass towers Clara inhabited. The room was half full of students, retirees, and local activists. As I set up my laptop, I saw my family slip into the back row, looking profoundly out of place. My father, in his golf shirt, looked like he'd taken a wrong turn. Clara, even in casual clothes, looked like a hawk in a sparrow's nest. Then I began to speak. I didn't talk about the award or the money. I talked about the work. I showed them photos, not of me, but of the communities. I showed them the before, a murky brown river where children collected water, and the after, a clear running spigot from one of our well installations. I showed them smiling faces, kids in the new school in Kenya, women who had started their own small businesses now that they didn't spend 6 hours a day hauling water. I told the story of a village elder in Peru who, after we'd trained his community to maintain the filters, took my hands and simply said, "You have given us back our children." I spoke for 30 minutes, my voice steady, passionate, and completely my own. When I finished, there was a warm, earnest round of applause. My family didn't clap. They just sat there stunned, as if they'd been struck. We went to a small cafe afterward, the four of us sliding into a booth. For a moment, we just sat. Then Clara, who had been staring into her cup, finally spoke. How? She asked, her voice quiet, stripped of all its sharp corporate authority. I don't understand how Emmy. I build cases with precedent and partners. You built wells. Out of nothing. How did you even start? It was the first real question she'd asked me in a decade. So I told her. I told her about the first failed grant proposals, the logistical nightmares the moment I thought I'd lose all my seed money to a corrupt shipping agent. I told her about learning to navigate 3 different legal systems, about designing blueprints on a bar napkin, about the sheer grinding persistence it took. A small laugh escaped me as I described accidentally flooding a supply truck with a faulty filter prototype. To my shock, Clara smiled. A real tired smile. "God, Em," she said, shaking her head. "I thought I was the one with the high-stress job. I'm just pushing paper. You're an operator." My father reached across the table and put his hand over mine. "Your presentation. Those children, Emmy. What you've done." His voice broke and he didn't try to hide it. "I've been a fool. I'm so proud of you I don't even have the words for it." My mother just watched me, her eyes tracing my face as if seeing it for the first time. "All that time," she whispered, "you were doing that. And I was sending you job postings for administrative assistants." A quiet apology more powerful than any grand gesture. Before we left, I looked at them, the remnants of my old judgmental family. "I'm glad you came today," I said, my voice firm but warm. "I want you in my world, but I need you to understand. This is my life. It's not a phase and it's not a competition. I love you all, but I am not sacrificing my purpose for your comfort ever again. I'm doing this work whether you're watching or not." My father nodded immediately. "We know, honey. We finally know." As we drove home, the late afternoon sun was warm, and the atmosphere in the car was changed. It wasn't fixed, but the deep toxic tension was gone, replaced by a tentative, fragile respect. I saw my parents exchange a quiet, meaningful glance. Clara was looking out the window, thoughtful and silent. I realized they weren't seeing Emmy the aimless one, or Emmy the cautionary tale. They were finally seeing Emmy Fisher, a strong, self-directed woman who had built a life of staggering meaning. They were finally beginning to understand. The following afternoon, the house was finally quiet. The last of the extended family had departed, their farewells to me starkly different from their arrivals. The backhanded pity was gone, replaced by a clumsy, awestruck respect. Uncle David had shaken my hand, his grip firm, his eyes full of a new, dazed understanding. "What you're doing, Emmy. It's just incredible," he'd said, clearing his throat. Incredible. Now only the 4 of us remained. Clara was packing her overnight bag, her movements slow and deliberate. She paused in the hallway, looking at me where I sat in the living room, a cup of tea cradled in my hands. "I'm heading out," she said. I nodded, waiting. She took a breath the way she used to before a major debate in high school. "I spent my entire life trying to win a game you weren't even playing, Em. I was so focused on the scoreboard, I missed everything. I'm sorry. Not just for what I said, but for not seeing you." It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. "I see you too, Clara," I replied. And I meant it. I saw her insecurity, the crushing weight of the expectations she'd chosen to carry. "Maybe we can just be sisters now, not competitors." A small, real smile touched her lips. "I'd like that." My parents walked her to the door. My father hugged her, but his eyes were on me. My mother, however, did something new. She kissed Clara, then walked over to me, took my face in her hands and kissed my forehead. "Your call is at 4, right?" she asked. "With the DC office. I'd mentioned it offhand at breakfast." I stared at her. "Yes." "We'll be quiet," she said. Just a simple acknowledgement, a small, perfect brick laid in the foundation of our new relationship. Clara left, and a profound, peaceful silence settled over the home. I didn't feel triumphant, not in the way Clara would have. I didn't feel a surge of victory. I just felt right. I felt a deep, anchoring clarity, a quiet, emotional independence I realized I'd had for years, but had only just now seen reflected in my family's eyes. My agency was my own. My pride wasn't in the Vanguard Award, it was in the 200,000 people who had clean water in the blueprints I'd drawn in the team I'd built. The award was just a byproduct of the work, and the work was what mattered. The reunion which I had dreaded as a tribunal had ended as a liberation. Not because I had won, but because I had been seen, and I had realized finally that I had never needed to be. The quiet revolution was complete, not with a bang, but with a peaceful mutual understanding. Later that evening, I sat on the back porch, the same porch swing where my father had given me his apology, my laptop open. The sun was setting, painting the suburban sky in hues of orange and deep purple. The house was quiet behind me. I could hear the faint, comforting clink of my mother cleaning the kitchen. The dishes long since washed, the evidence of the reunion scrubbed clean, leaving a fresh start. My phone buzzed, and I answered the video call. The face of my field director, Ben, smiled at me from Kenya, the connection slightly grainy. Emmy, the first shipment of new filters arrived, the ones your new funding secured. It's like Christmas here, boss. I smiled, my heart full. How's the test well in the northern sector? Flowing clean, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We're changing the map, Emmy. You're really doing it. We discussed logistics for another 20 minutes, my voice low, professional, and full of purpose. I spoke of supply chains and policy benchmarks, my world expanding to fill the continents Ben's call represented. As I was hanging up, I noticed my mother and father standing at the screen door, simply watching. They weren't interrupting, weren't judging, weren't offering advice about 401ks. They were just admiring. My mother raised a hand in a quiet wave, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated support. I waved back. I closed my laptop, the screen going dark. I sat for a long time listening to the crickets begin their evening song. The air was cool, the porch was quiet, and the sunset was fading. I was Emmy Fisher. I was home in this intimate family setting, and I was also simultaneously in a village halfway across the world. My path was clear, and for the first time I knew I could walk it, balancing my own hard-won fulfillment with the complex, imperfect, and finally accepting love of my family. And with that, the quiet revolution was finally complete. Emmy had found her peace not by winning, but by being understood. What did you think of her family's transformation? We read every single comment to get your thoughts on the story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.